In this lesson, we'll discuss the Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, John Brown and the raid on Harper's Ferry, the election of 1860, and finally, secession. In the election of 1858, Abraham Lincoln was running for senator against Stephen Douglas in his home state of Illinois. Lincoln launched his Senate campaign with his House Divided speech, in which he discussed his belief that the United States could not survive for long with such a deep gulf between the North and South over slavery. Lincoln will lose this election, but this will be the last election that he loses to Stephen Douglas. Dred Scott is going to be a figure that's going to bring a lot of attention to slavery and its expansion into the territories as well. Dred Scott was a slave who belonged to a man named John Emerson. Emerson was an army surgeon who brought Scott while he traveled from the slave territory of Missouri to the free state of Illinois and Wisconsin, which was above the Missouri Compromise line, where they lived for 4 years. After they returned to the slave state of Missouri, Emerson died. At that point, Dred Scott sued for his freedom, since he believed that he was due his freedom because he had lived in a free state and territory for a number of years. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, wrote the majority opinion. The court decided that Dred Scott was still a slave, and Taney could have ended there, but he continued to add that slaves were not citizens and therefore had no right to even bring a court case to the Supreme Court or any court. Congress could not forbid slavery in any territory because owners could bring their property to any state, and in effect, slaves were the property of their owners. Southerners were jubilant. Northerners were disgusted with the decision, and the decision, in effect, meant that no state could outlaw slavery, and that slavery could actually reach into any part of the United States. At the same time, Kansas had voted to decide whether their constitution would allow slavery. The Missouri border ruffians had come over the border and illegally voted, causing Kansas to become a slave state. The pro-slavery government wrote the Lecompton Constitution and began operating their government based on that. The anti-slavery forces wrote the Topeka Constitution and began operating a separate government based on that constitution. President Buchanan sided with the pro-slavery forces of the Lecompton Constitution, and Stephen Douglas convinced Congress to back the anti-slavery settlers who had written the Topeka Constitution. So now you have two divided governments in Kansas. In the 1858 Illinois state race, a little-known backwoods farmer named Abraham Lincoln ran against a 2-term, well-funded professional politician named Stephen Douglas. So Stephen Douglas and Abe Lincoln met in a series of debates which were called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Each man outlined his opinion and stance on the expansion of slavery into the territories. So within the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln clearly outlined his feeling that slavery was immoral. Lincoln doubted that slavery would cease to spread without legislation that actually prevented it from spreading into the territories. And he accuses Stephen Douglas of defending the Dred Scott decision and supporting slavery. Stephen Douglas, on the other hand, believed that popular sovereignty would allow slavery to pass away on its own. And he really did believe that the areas of Kansas and Nebraska would have eventually voted to not have slaves in their states because plantation and cash crops would not do well in that area of the country. He also accused Lincoln of being an abolitionist and of wanting equality for slaves. But in reality, neither candidate promoted slavery. In their second debate in Freeport, Lincoln asked if settlers could vote to exclude slavery before a territory became a state, knowing that the Dred Scott decision had already said no and that slavery could expand anywhere. Douglas replied that slavery could not exist if the local police regulations would not enforce laws protecting slaveholder property. Even though Stephen Douglas won the Senate seat that year, his presidential bid was over, and the Democratic Party that he represented became further split on the issue of slavery based on sectional lines. John Brown, again, is going to become involved with the issue of slavery as he conducts something called the Raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, Brown thought that God had told him to start a slave uprising, and he was an active abolitionist, as we already know from Kansas and from Bleeding Kansas. His plan was to arm the slaves and let them kill their masters, and he had secretly obtained financial backing from Northern abolitionists to help to incite a slave riot. In Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, was an arsenal that he hoped would provide the weapons that he needed for the slave uprising. So Brown led 21 men into Harper's Ferry, captured the town and many of its residents, but no slaves came to be able to aid in the uprising. Brown and his men were eventually captured by Colonel Robert E. Lee and the United States Marines after this failed attempt to start an uprising. He was put on trial, found guilty, and hung. The North did not condone Brown's actions, but they treated him as a martyr because he was an abolitionist trying to bring about the end of slavery. The South grew more fearful of other planned insurrections and slave revolts as a result of John Brown and the Raid on Harper's Ferry. In the election of 1860, the 6-year-old Republican Party held their second presidential convention in Chicago. William Seward was the favorite, but had other enemies within the party over the handling of the slave states. So Lincoln's name was actually nominated third on the ballot. Southerners felt that Lincoln was what was called a black Republican who wanted to immediately emancipate or free the slaves. Lincoln was actually satisfied for slavery to stay where it existed, and he never really did speak out for equality. He did not want slavery to expand any further into the territories. Lincoln will end up winning the northern states, while the middle and southern states will split their votes among the other three Republican candidates, or the other three candidates, Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell. And so Lincoln will be elected the 16th President of the United States. Between Election Day in November and when Lincoln took the oath of office in March, President Buchanan watched as the South prepared to secede from the Union. This is one of the reasons why James Buchanan is rated as our worst president in history. South Carolina was the first to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860, so they didn't even wait for Abraham Lincoln to become inaugurated. Its population celebrated with fireworks and parties. Mississippi will secede 3 weeks later, followed by the states of Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Delegates from the seceded states met to form the Confederate States of America, or the CSA, on February 4th, 1861. They wrote a new constitution acknowledging states' rights and slavery. They elected a president named Jefferson Davis, and they elected Alexander Stephens as vice president. The more educated people of the day knew that this was not a problem that was going to be solved peacefully or quickly. General Tecumseh Sherman, who is a future Union soldier who takes Georgia, wrote that the division would eventually result in bloodshed, and we'll discuss the impact of the secession of the southern states as we discuss the journey towards the Civil War in class.